The storming of the Bastille on July 14th, 1789 in Paris was a symbolic popular uprising that ignited the French Revolution. Not just for their freedoms, the rot at the core of the financial system keeping the country afloat was one of the most critical factors as well. For years, the French monarchy hid behind grand ceremonies, immense wealth, and divine rights, giving the impression that it would last forever. But beneath the dazzling, magnificent chandeliers of Versailles, the reality was different. The French state had reached the point where it could no longer pay its debts. The revolution did not begin with philosophy or ideas. It began with debt. It began with rising inflation. It began when people were pushed to a point so desperate they couldn't even scrape together enough money to buy bread. The guillotine was not made of iron. It was made of ledgers. If you see this as nothing more than a story left behind in the past, think again. The mistakes that brought the French monarchy to its knees, reckless borrowing, unjust taxation, and a currency losing its value, are still staring us in the face today. A strong but rotten system. At the time, France was one of the most powerful nations in Europe, with a population of roughly 30 million fertile farmland and enormous global ambitions. But beneath the surface, it was rotting from within. Its financial system was outdated, riddled with corruption, and simply incapable of sustaining a modern state. England had established its central bank in 1694 and built a bond market that efficiently financed its wars. France, meanwhile, was clinging to methods left over from centuries past. Taxes weren't collected by the state directly. Instead, private individuals known as tax farmers paid the government a lump sum up front for the right to collect revenue, and then squeezed peasants mercilessly, pocketing the difference. Government positions were sold to the wealthy as investment vehicles, creating a parasitic bureaucracy more concerned with protecting its own privileges than serving the public. The result was a state that hemorrhaged money at the top while suffocating the people at the bottom. Wars exposed everything. The wars of the 18th century tore that rotting structure wide open. The War of Austrian Succession in the 1740s, the 7 Years' War in the 1750s, and especially France's support for the American War of Independence in the 1770s, piled debt onto the monarchy. Siding with America against Britain might have felt like sweet revenge, but financially it was no different from suicide. By the early 1780s, the French crown had borrowed over 1 billion livres to finance the conflict. The interest on that debt alone consumed more than half of all royal revenue. Think about it this way. More than half of every livre coming in goes straight to interest payments, and you're still borrowing more. That was France. Versailles gleamed with gold. But it was ordinary people who carried the weight. Justice? No. Privilege. The tax system exempted the wealthiest classes, the nobility and the clergy, from direct taxation. These two estates, representing a tiny fraction of the population, paid either very little or nothing at all. The third estate, the common people, who made up more than 90% of the population, paid land taxes, salt taxes, church tithes, and countless feudal obligations. Bread accounted for up to 70% of an ordinary worker's daily expenses. When crop failures hit in the late 1780s, prices doubled. Riots broke out in the streets of Paris over bread long before the storming of the Bastille. For the people, the picture was clear. Unrelenting taxation with no relief, and merciless inflation had turned simple survival into a political act. Reform was tried. Privilege won. The monarchy wanted change, but privilege blocked the way every single time. Finance Minister Turgot put forward a sweeping plan: abolish tax exemptions, modernize the revenue system, cut court spending. The nobility refused. Another reformer, Necker, took an unprecedented step and published the royal accounts for the public to see. The deficits they revealed sent a chill through the nation. By the late 1780s, ministers were warning Louis XVI one by one, the monarchy is bankrupt. But every attempt to fix the system ran into the same wall. The nobles and clergy would not surrender their privileges, and the king lacked the will to force them. Collapse became inevitable. By 1788, the monarchy could no longer borrow on reasonable terms. Creditors either demanded sky-high interest rates or simply refused to lend at all. The government could no longer pay its contractors or its soldiers. That year, a severe famine drove bread prices to historic highs. Hunger riots erupted across the country. In desperation, Louis XVI convened the Estates General in 1789, for the first time in over 150 years. On the surface, the goal was to resolve the fiscal crisis and approve new taxes. But in reality, that meeting cracked the dam open and let the revolution pour through. The representatives of the Third Estate saw the truth. The problem wasn't just a broken budget. The problem was a system designed to keep them poor while enriching the privileged classes. When their demands were ignored, they declared themselves the National Assembly. Shortly after the Bastille fell, the revolution had begun. But here's what most history books quietly skip over. The Bastille didn't fall because of ideology alone. It fell because the French financial system collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Revolutions may begin with ideals, but they always run on money. New power, same old problem. When the monarchy was overthrown, the new revolutionary government inherited the same old problem: an empty treasury and a mountain of debt. The people expected liberty, equality, and bread. What they got was hunger, unpaid soldiers, and creditors closing in from every direction. The revolution couldn't survive on slogans. It needed money. The Assignat, a brilliant idea with a tragic end. The National Assembly seized on a solution that seemed brilliant to everyone at the time: seize the lands of the Catholic Church and use those assets as the backing for a new currency. In 1790, the revolutionary government issued assignats, paper money backed by the confiscated land. At first glance, it looked like financial genius. France was rich in land but short on liquidity. By monetizing church property, the state could put wealth into circulation, pay off debts, and let the economy breathe again. Assignats were marketed as the people's money, a democratic alternative to the old royal order. People embraced them as a genuine break from aristocratic privilege. For a brief moment, confidence returned. The printing press couldn't be stopped, but paper money carries a curse. Once politicians see that it works a little, they cannot resist printing more. The first issuance of assignats was at a manageable level, but the government quickly fell into the trap of printing far beyond the value of the land backing them. What started as a limited solution became a flood that couldn't be contained. By 1792, billions of livres worth of assignats were in circulation. Inflation picked up speed. The more that was printed, the more worthless the money became. By 1793, the assignat had lost more than half its value. By 1795, it was nearly worthless. People were carrying stacks of paper just to buy a single loaf of bread. Farmers hoarded their grain, refusing to sell their crops in exchange for notes that lost value overnight. Shopkeepers stopped accepting assignats altogether. Trust in the currency collapsed completely. Money became a weapon. On top of all this, assignats became a target for counterfeiting. Enemy powers hostile to the revolution, Britain chief among them, deliberately flooded France with forged assignats, accelerating the collapse of confidence. The war was no longer being fought only on battlefields. It was being waged by destroying money itself. What had been presented as the people's currency was turned into a weapon against the very people it was supposed to serve. The social devastation of inflation. The consequences were devastating. Urban workers watched their wages melt away in the face of inflation. Savings evaporated. Soldiers and civil servants were paid in paper that lost its value before it could even be spent. As bread became unaffordable once again, riots broke out in marketplaces across the country. The revolution, born in the name of economic justice, had unleashed a new injustice upon the world: hyperinflation. The government turned to price controls. Those failed too. Rather than stabilizing supply, they drove trade underground. Farmers refused to bring grain to market. Black markets flourished, and with inflation came paranoia. Radical leaders like Robespierre turned economic failure into fuel for political terror. Those accused of hoarding grain, speculating, or undermining the currency were branded enemies of the revolution. Thousands were executed, not for plotting against liberty, but for failing to comply with the unwritten rules of a broken economy. The guillotine was no longer just a tool of political justice. It had become a tool of economic control. Inflation had turned into blood. The fall of the assignat and history's bitter repetition. By 1796, the assignat had fallen into such disrepute that it was abandoned entirely. In its place came another paper currency, the mandates, which collapsed just as quickly. France lurched from one failed experiment to the next, each one promising salvation, each one dragging the country deeper into the mire. The revolution had promised freedom, but when it came to money, what it delivered was chaos. If this sounds familiar, it's because we have watched the same scene play out repeatedly throughout economic history. In 1920s Weimar Germany, marks were printed until they were worth less than the paper they were printed on. In 2000s Zimbabwe, trillion-dollar banknotes were issued that couldn't buy a bag of groceries. Even today, central banks flood economies with liquidity every time a crisis strikes, convincing themselves that printing can solve structural problems. The French Revolution shows us the pattern clearly. Printing money buys time, but it never buys stability. Napoleon and the return of order. By the mid-1790s, France was an exhausted nation. The monarchy was gone, the nobility scattered, the clergy stripped of their property. And yet the financial nightmare had only deepened. The paper money that was supposed to save the people had destroyed their savings. Inflation had turned bread into a luxury and survival into a daily battle. The guillotine had silenced dissent, but it could never silence hunger. In this climate of chaos, one truth had become impossible to deny. Revolutions may topple thrones, but without economic stability, they eventually consume themselves. It was in this environment that Napoleon Bonaparte rose. He was not merely a brilliant commander. He was someone who instinctively grasped the power of order, both military and financial. When he seized power in 1799, one of his first priorities was to stabilize the currency. In 1800, drawing partly on the model of the Bank of England, he founded the Bank of France and set about rebuilding confidence in money and credit. The message was unmistakable. Liberty had unleashed chaos, but order, backed by a strong financial system, would put France back on its feet. A people exhausted by years of inflation and uncertainty welcomed it wholeheartedly. Napoleon's military genius is celebrated endlessly, but without this financial reset, his empire would most likely never have held together. The Revolution's true lesson. It is this: financial systems are the skeleton of political power. If the skeleton is fragile, no amount of flesh and muscle can hold the body together. France in the 1780s borrowed recklessly, taxed unjustly, and unleashed devastating inflation. The result was not merely a financial crisis, it was the complete collapse of a regime. When a government can no longer convince creditors to lend, when the people lose faith in the currency, when bread prices double while wages stand still, no throne is safe. The past is a mirror of today. This is not just a story from the past. Look at the present, and the parallels are impossible to ignore. During the Eurozone crisis of the 2000s, countries like Greece were crushed under debt burdens so heavy they lost the capacity to govern. Austerity was imposed to preserve the financial system at any cost. Hospitals closed, pension payments cut, while ordinary people bore the weight. The debt ceiling debates in the United States reveal a government that cannot balance its books, one that depends on printing and bond markets just to survive. Central banks, much like the revolutionaries with their assignats, flood economies with liquidity to buy time. Inflation, once thought to be a relic of the past, has returned, and once again it is punishing savers and workers. The French Revolution shows us something else as well. It is dangerous to believe that laws and institutions alone will protect the people. England's South Sea bubble in 1720 had already demonstrated what financial mania could do. In 1789, France repeated the mistake on a national scale. In 2008, the world fell into the same trap again through housing markets and mortgage-backed securities. Every time, elites were protected while ordinary people absorbed the pain. Every time, the lesson was buried under promises of reform. And every time, the same structure survived: a financial system built to protect itself first and people second. So, what should we do? First, financial education is survival. If you don't understand how debt, taxation, and inflation shape your life, you will be the one left paying the bill when the system stumbles. Second, real wealth is not paper promises, it is assets, skills, and independence that don't evaporate when governments print their way out of trouble. Third, never mistake stability for justice. The French Revolution replaced one injustice with another because it never solved the underlying economic rot. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. The rhyme of the French Revolution is a warning. When governments borrow far beyond their means, when elites slip free of the burdens carried by the people, and when money itself loses trust, collapse becomes inevitable. The guillotine is gone. But the consequences of broken finance are still with us: unemployment, inflation, social unrest, and the rise of strongmen who promise order at any price. The French Revolution was not only about liberty, equality, and fraternity. It was about debt, inflation, and bread. It was about a financial system that pushed its people past the breaking point. If you think we are too clever today to make the same mistakes, remember this: the Bourbons thought exactly the same thing. If this video gave you a new perspective, don't forget to subscribe. Take good care of yourselves. See you next time.